Welcome to this morning's session, Rights of Way Management, a discussion on best practices for infrastructure siting. We have a great panel here today with lots of experience. So just let me introduce myself first. I'm Jennifer Lee from the City of Portland. I'm the utility program manager there, so I manage the utility franchises and also wireless right-of-way siting for the city. So up here we have to my right, Milo Meacham. Milo Meacham is with the League of Oregon Cities. He's been there since 1995 and provides city attorney services to two small cities and also other cities in areas of telecommunications and public finance. He also has responsibility for management of land use planning services at LCOG. And next to Milo, we have Mary. Mary Lefebvre is here from CenturyLink. She's the director of video affairs and has been with the company for 35 years in a variety of roles, including legal and public policy. In her current position, she has responsibility for acquisition for video franchises throughout the company, as well as for video policy issues. Let's see. And then finally, to her right, we have Ray Bailey and Ken Feldman. Ray is with the City of Tacoma and is the Public Works Division Manager of the Street Operations Division, which is responsible for maintaining the city streets, parks, grounds, street lights, traffic signals, and street signs. And Ken Feldman is a partner in the Denver law firm of Kissinger and Feldman. His practice emphasizes local government representation, particularly telecommunications law. So without further ado, I think we're going to start with Milo.
We play musical chairs here. As was mentioned, I'm with the Lane Council of Governments. What I wanted to talk about is the views of the right-of-way, and I kind of have a different perspective. For a long time, I've been an advocate working with cities on franchises and so forth. We were fortunate enough to get a BTOP grant, and that put me into the position of being a provider in a way, having to go out and negotiate franchises and so forth. And it gave me a very different perspective on the whole question of franchising and control of the right-of-way. And to a certain extent, I did go over to the dark side, but I
welcome you.
I think that I have a different perspective from the provider side as well. And what I would argue is that we really need to take a new view of rights of way and management of the right of way. And we get away from the traditional view where the industry says, well, all municipal control of the right-of-way is bad, and the municipal view is that all municipal control of the right-of-way is good, and there's nothing that is ever done that's wrong. And a more realistic view, I would say, is that there's maybe three kinds of municipal control of the right-of-way. And I would say that the vigilant municipalities, the vigilant local governments that control the right-of-way are doing it right, and I'll get to why in a second. There are still the bad cases, the rapacious kind of local government that looks at the control of the right-of-way and the franchise process as a way to get something special. And then there's what I would regard as the worst of all, and that is that the local governments that don't care about the right-of-way, that don't do anything about it at all. What I would call the vigilant regulators always require you to go through the process, but they've got a process in place, and it's possible to work through it, and that's a good thing. It may cost time. You may end up paying a little bit more, but the results are predictable and manageable. And from the provider standpoint, that's the best thing of all, because you get you get through the process, you know what you're going to be involved in, and you can set out the time frames and those kinds of things. As I said, there are still the rapacious regulators. When we were working on the BTOP grant, we had a couple of cities. We went there and we said, okay, we need a franchise to come in and connect City Hall and the school and so forth. And one city did actually say, well, that's great, you know, we really welcome you here, but we're trying to build a municipal swimming pool. And so if you could only make a contribution to help us out with the municipal swimming pool, we'd be more than happy to give you a franchise. Well, we went through the process, you know, of the pointing out to them that that's not really legal, and they're required to treat all franchisees the same way and so forth. And eventually they came around, but there are some, I know, in the BTOP program, some places were just skipped because they were too much trouble to work with. They wanted too much extra out of the process. So there's still those people out there, and as local government advocates, we need to work on them to straighten them out, because they are a barrier, and they provide the industry with all sorts of horror stories that sometimes are true. And then there's the neglectful ones, the ones that don't care about the franchises at all. And the problem with them is that it leads to all sorts of abuses, all sorts of problems. This is an illustration of one such problem. This is an actual utility pole, and to give you a close-up of what it is, when the utility came in, they replaced an old pole with a new pole, but they didn't finish out the process. There's still wires connected to the old pole, and it's kind of tied to the new pole. That makes it very difficult to work in this community when you come through with your engines and so forth, and you can kind of see one of the lines that's going around the old pole and things like that. These are the neglectful ones, the people that don't care about their right-of-way, and so they let, and it's usually the first utility in there, do whatever they want, get away with whatever they want, and the subsequent utility people are in a bad way because they have to work around this. This situation cost us about $5,000 because we had to come in and replace the pole again and go through the whole process all over again so that we could hang our fiber on the pole. So that leads me to the next thing that I want to show you, which is a video. Oregon, like other places, is kind of under attack with the notion that we should do away with local franchising. And sometimes the stories are about the rapacious ones, about the ugly municipalities that neglect the process, and therefore this kind of feeds the viewpoint that local franchising is a bad thing. One of the things that we've done is we've developed a video in Oregon arguing about the importance of the local franchising process. And as soon as it loads here, I'll show you the video. And when this concludes, there's, whoops, that's where you can see the video. Hopefully it'll load here in a second.
Looks a lot like the mayor of Orlando.
It does, and I apologize for that. Well,
okay.
Okay.
Here comes technical support.
Here comes technical support.
Can you make the mouse over that video and perhaps trigger the light?
Well, I tried that, and the mouse isn't here. There we are. All right. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I thought I had tried that. Okay. It takes a second for the audio to come on here, but we'll run through this. It takes about 5 minutes. This was sponsored by the League of Oregon Cities, and I see many of the people that were involved in it in the audience.
Every day we make use of our streets and public rights of way. Though most folks don't give it a lot of thought. But like the airwaves used by radio and TV, the streets and public rights of way in our cities belong not to any one person, but to all of us. Our publicly owned streets and rights of way are primarily managed and maintained on behalf of all users by Oregon local governments. Our streets and rights of way surround and connect us. Each of us uses this unique resource when we go to work, access goods or services, pick up our kids from school, or visit family and friends. We use utility networks and our rights of way to cook our food and heat our homes. Besides water, plumbing, and electricity, our streets also host critical pathways to phones, computers, televisions, and the global internet. Whether the connections are wired or wireless, commercial businesses depend on the people's property to deliver connections that allow us to stay in touch with each other and the world. We also depend on our streets and property to keep us safe, healthy, and free from harm.
Of course, keeping streets in good repair isn't free. There's a cost for maintaining all of this, not to mention coordinating work of many different users to minimize the headaches for us all.
Not only does it cost money to keep the public right-of-way accessible and useful for everyone, but many of the users are private companies, for-profit companies who pay rent to we the people in various forms, primarily to Oregon local governments. The streets and rights of way are our collective property as taxpayers, right? Since the public is the ultimate landlord, cities manage the people's property on the public's behalf. After all, it wouldn't be very responsible to let private companies use our streets for free, would it?
Charging rent for use of public facilities by private people is nothing new here in Oregon. For years we've been doing this, been managing it because of the Oregon Constitution and home rule, also under city charters and state law. We are charged with managing the public's right-of-way. No, the voters expect us to make sure that they get a proper return for the use of their publicly owned right-of-way. And that's what we do.
Fortunately, our partners in federal and state government have long understood the importance of ensuring rent is paid for public property, and many federal statutes reinforce this critical principle.
Federal funds were used to map out the Oregon Trail. In other words, management of our public right-of-ways started with our early pioneers to ensure transportation network benefited everyone, not just our commercial interests.
What was once a dirt track now includes essential services, water, sewer, gas, communications.
Internet access is our new essential service, connecting us to jobs, education, and health. Cities must ensure that this critical service is as available as other essential services are using public rights-of-way.
It takes a lot of planning to make sure that when work is done on one part of the street, it creates as little impact as possible on all the other users and users. And care must be taken to assure all service needs are met equally and fairly. These services need maintenance, repairs, and additions. More and more wires, pipes, and cables are being added to our right-of-way to meet the needs of ever-changing technology. Even wireless phones now increasingly need right-of-way antennas and facilities to connect to backhaul landlines. All of this has to be handled and coordinated with as little disruption to traffic and businesses as possible. Municipalities must also respond to safety issues. In any construction project, access for emergency vehicles needs to be planned.
These additions and repairs to the right-of-way are happening all the time. The number of requests for construction permits has increased dramatically, and yet the fee structure has not changed hardly at all.
Oregon communities are very different from each other. That's why a construction schedule for Nehalem
might not work in Beaverton at all.
Wait, did we mention that none of this is free? If each company had to spend the time and money to buying space to lay their pipes, wires, and cables, the cost of providing their services would increase considerably. This compensation may take different forms depending on the community, but all of it is returned to the ultimate owner, the public, in the form of critical municipal services such as police, fire, parks, and street repairs.
Every so often, there are proposals to cut back Oregon right-of-way fees
or change the law to make one size fit all in distinctly different Oregon communities.
What works in Portland may not work well here in Cottage Grove. We have to keep the faith of the citizens and taxpayers and make sure that both the right-of-ways are protected for all users and that the public is fairly compensated.
After all, the streets and rights-of-way in Oregon belong to everyone.
So the rest of the video is just shots of all the cities that we're shown in. And unless you're an Oregonian, that probably doesn't mean anything to you. Thanks. Normally the sound is more coordinated with the video. I don't know what happened with technology here, but anyway, if these are available on the web, if you want to view them on your own time, and that's the gist of my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have a team, Ken and Ray.
Where do you sit here? Because we're going to tag team this. All right. Now we have to find the presentation. Okay, Ray, where is it? Oh. It's that one. Yep.
Okay.
Oops. Let's go to slideshow.
They don't show my notes.
From beginning.
Oh. There you go.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. So Ray and I are going to tag team this a little bit. A number of years ago, Tacoma, Washington decided it was time to take a look at and rewrite the city's rights-of-way code provisions. I was retained as outside counsel to work with the city staff. Ray is in the Public Works Department, so he's going to talk about his perspective of this after I kind of give some of the overview. So we started in 2008, and why did they do it then? At the time, the city had two cable franchises, one with Comcast, one with the Click network, which is actually owned by Tacoma Power? Tacoma Power, which is a city-owned utility. So they were engaging in two franchise renewals. As many of you know, we periodically have rights-of-way provisions in our franchises as well as in our codes. And upon a preliminary review, it became apparent the city had in its code one chapter on rights-of-way, a completely separate chapter dealing with cable systems, a completely separate chapter dealing with telecom systems, all of which had some references to rights-of-way management and oversight, and then two cable franchises with rights-of-way provisions in them. And then what we found out was these code provisions were not consistent. There were issues relating to rights-of-way management and control in the cable chapter and in the telecom chapter that really shouldn't have been in there at all. They should have been in the right-of-way chapter. There were provisions in the franchises on rights-of-way that were not consistent with what was in the code. Brian Grogan mentioned this. He had one slide if you were at the cable franchise session that just preceded this, and this, you can think of this session as taking Brian's one slide and making it into an entire presentation. But his point was, when you're doing a franchise negotiation, you got to look at what you have in your code and make sure they're consistent, and that's exactly what Tacoma did here. Just some examples of the inconsistencies. Who enforces, which department in the city enforces was different in different parts of the code. What the penalties were different in different parts of the code versus what was in some of the franchise requirements. There was one chapter of the code that referenced separate city design manual regulations and stormwater regulations that dealt with rights-of-way management that were not in other provisions of the code that presumably told you what you needed to do with respect to the rights-of-way. There was one chapter that had language that suggested that it might not be applicable to governmental entities that had facilities in the rights-of-way. So do we treat governmental entities different from the private sector? Tacoma has traditionally made an effort to treat the CLIC network, a city-owned network, comparably to the private sector. And yet there was a provision in the code that seemed to give them a free pass if they wanted to, although it wasn't being enforced that way. And there were just indemnification and insurance provisions, different in the franchise versus the code, and the definitions were different. So a variety of issues that needed to be addressed. So what's the role of outside counsel in this kind of a process? One was to help organize a staff team and to sort of brainstorm on who should be at the table. So we had a representative of Public Works, we had Jeff Leaders from the cable office, we had IT. We also, the city was working with Brian to negotiate their franchises, so obviously we had to coordinate the franchise renewal process with the code revision process, and then periodically we had others that we needed to work with on city staff, risk management on the insurance issues, city attorney periodically on a number of issues. I would just point out as an aside, if at all possible, look at your codes and get them fixed before you get into renewal. It created a whole host of additional, Jeff is nodding his head, a whole host of additional challenges to try to get this done while we were concurrently negotiating a franchise renewal. And I would tell you, as you know, one of the things that, again, depending upon what your staff resources are in-house, one of the roles of outside counsel was to really get into this. That each of the 3 chapters I mentioned were between 30 and 70 pages long. Complicated stuff. The design manuals were over 20 pages long. There were separate ordinances that also tangentially applied to right-of-way management. There was a noise ordinance that impacted some of the rights-of-way provisions. There was a separate municipal court remedies enforcement section of the code that impacted this. And if you're going to really do a good job in being one of those vigilant communities that Milo was referencing, you got to read this stuff really, really careful and get really deep into the weeds and figure out how to make this stuff consistent. I might point out that I live in Colorado. This work was in Washington. If you follow the news, the phrase "get into the weeds" means something different today than it did a few years ago when we were working on this project. I refer to it as reading this stuff really carefully and getting a good understanding of it. So we had a number of challenges. The first was, which one of these chapters do we need to do first? We decided to do the cable chapter first because we were starting negotiations, but again, we had coordination that we had to do with how those negotiations were going. One of the issues you need to think about is, do you need to have extensive rights-of-way provisions in your franchise agreement? For some cities, you do. For some, you might not. My preference, personally, is that this is a police power. It is not something that needs to be negotiated and put into a contract. So if you have a good code, it is advisable to minimize what you have in the franchise other than to say, you must comply with the code and get it in your code. There are many communities that, depending upon your state law, you might be able to franchise cable, but you can't franchise telephone or internet. You have gas and electric, you have water. Any of those entities who are digging in your streets, you want them to play by the same set of rules. So to the extent that you can get it in the code and then you really don't need it in the franchise, I would encourage you to look at that. The goal here, though, for Tacoma was to take all the rights-of-way stuff out of the cable chapter, out of the telecom chapter, and put it in one place in a right-of-way chapter. But then on the coordination, we had the problem, well, if you take it out of the cable chapter and you approve the cable chapter first and you haven't finished approving the rights-of-way chapter, have we eliminated all of our regulations for some period of time? So again, doing it at the time of franchise negotiations created a whole bunch of additional challenges. So identify who are the parties that you need to be talking to about this. Ray is going to talk about some of the inside parties, the people within the organization that needed to be at the table, or at least periodically, whose feedback we saw. But we also wanted to share with outside parties, with the industry, with Mary's company, CenturyLink. Quest at the time was one of the parties that was at the table with us, working through the drafts, the cable companies, but not just cable and telephone. We had the gas and electric there. Gas was a private investor-owned utility. Electric is a city utility. We had the home builders. You think of all the different entities that are involved in rights-of-way development, and we had them at the table. And Mary Quest was very good to work with. We didn't always agree, but we had some problems with some of our parties in this process, and you guys weren't one of them, so thank you for that. And working with the staff to get through the politics, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes here. Another challenge is making sure that everything you're doing is consistent with state and federal law. So we have Section 253 of the Telecom Act that we always have to be aware of, but we also have state laws, and state laws in many places treat municipalities different than counties. So depending upon what kind of jurisdiction you are, you need to make sure that you are dealing with being consistent with the scope of your state authority. Just as an aside, I'm currently working on a similar project for Thurston County, Washington, which for those of you outside of Washington is the county where Olympia is. And in some ways, we're using some of the good work that we did in Tacoma to help Thurston County, but they've got a whole different state structure on what counties can do versus what cities can do. So you really have to be sensitive to that. So, and again, as I mentioned earlier, what do you want to put in the code versus what do you want to put in your franchise? And I would just say here, in some of the other communities I've worked with, when I have suggested we ought to put this in the code and take it out of the franchise, sometimes the pushback I get is, you know, our code is really in bad shape, and it'll be much harder to get this through council to convince them that we have to rewrite the code versus just doing the franchise agreement and negotiating it in the franchise agreement. You know, that's okay for the entity that has the franchise. And I get this, certainly I get the politics of sometimes it's hard to get something through council. But if you're going to advocate for what is in the best long-term interest of the community, and I know you've got to work your way up through the process, but you know, to me, you should be talking to the city manager about, as hard as it might be, you really want to have your code up to date. So then we have a draft, and now it's time to negotiate. I did not coordinate my slides with Milo, but Darth Vader seems to be a popular figure to put in our graphics. And actually, the negotiations were they were tough, but I do think they were fair, and we got great feedback. And here's the thing you need to realize: the city had legitimate interest that it needed to accomplish in this code revision, and at the same time, the users of the rights-of-way also have legitimate interests, and the private sector ones, as to how they do their business. And what we found was, in a number of the sections, the industry representatives or an industry representative would say, we see what you're trying to get, and we don't disagree that you need to get there, but the way you're proposing to do it in this draft will cause us a ton of money, and we think there's another way you can do it. And we actually learned a lot in this process, and we made a number of changes to do it the way they were suggesting it, because it still got us to the goal that we wanted to get to, and it did it in a way that made it more effective for that particular industry representative. We occasionally had some problem children to deal with, and we would, there were different representatives. Quest had their engineers there. I love that, because they actually knew what it meant to get in the right of way and pull a permit. But we had a couple of lawyers, and we had a couple of policy people. No offense to the government affairs folks. It's real easy for the lawyers to send letters saying, we read your draft and you can't do that. And so there were some of the parties that we had to have one-on-ones with and periodically explain to them why, yeah, really we can do that, and we need to do that, and we're going to do it. So let's figure out a way to do it in a way that also works for you. You're not going to sing any first? I am not going to sing, Jerry. Sorry. Right. Yeah. So, political considerations. Everybody is a little bit different. Do you do a study session before you take the new ordinance to council? Do you have to have executive sessions to meet privately with the council to talk about the legal issues involved? And sometimes you do, depending upon how much of the you can't do that you get from some of the other parties. In Tacoma's case, they had council committees, and the ordinance process requires it to go through a committee before you get to the full council. One of the things that we learned in the process was that there were some of the parties who, while they came to the meetings and regularly engaged with us in a very respectful, if somewhat assertive way, they were initially, unbeknownst to us, also lobbying certain council members, and there were a couple of council members who were more inclined to be on the industry side of the dispute than the city side. And the first time we had to go to a council committee with the first ordinance, we were kind of brutally experienced the results of not having prepped council or understanding the politics completely. And really, you're putting a lot of work into this, and you're trying to get it done right, and it would be really nice to not get thrown under the bus. Jeff's name was under there for the first council committee hearing that we went to. Carol Mathewson, who many of you know, also had a major role in this process, but everybody loves Carol, so it was real easy to throw Jeff under the bus. Right. So at the end of the day, though, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ray to talk about some of the internal workings. This process worked. It worked great. And we must have had 6 or 7 meetings over a year and a half with the industry to go over drafts and to get their feedback and to, again, to argue sometimes, but to negotiate and to explain. But when it was done, every single industry representative that came to the public hearing at City Council got up and thanked the staff in the public meeting for letting them sit at the table, for hearing their voice. A few of them said, we don't agree with all of it, but we agree with most of it, and we understand what the rules are, and they're better rules than what we had when we started, and we just appreciate that we had an opportunity to be part of this process. So that's my advice to you, if you get one thing out of this, is that when you rewrite your code, incorporate the people who are going to be affected by it in your discussions before you bring it forward through the political process. And it will be frustrating at times, but it will be much more successful when you get to the finish line, which is the public hearing in front of your elected officials.
Thanks, Ken. Once again, my name is Ray Bailey. I'm a Public Works Division Manager.
Yep. Okay, I didn't see the green light.
Sorry about that. Anyways, I'm a Public Works Division Manager, and at the time we wrote this code, I was actually the division manager responsible for the enforcement of the rights-of-way. And unbeknownst to me, unfortunately, I didn't even realize that we had other rights-of-way provisions in the telecom and cable sections of the code. So I'm off doing my own little thing in my little rights-of-way world, not realizing that I was missing a whole section of enforcement that I was responsible for. So that was a little bit of embarrassing to me when I found that out. The city of Tacoma is kind of unique, and Ken alluded to this. The city has its own cable company, Click Network. I think it's one of the few municipalities actually in the nation that has their own cable company. So we're in direct competition with a very large cable provider. We have our own power company. We provide the electricity to the city residents and businesses as well as to neighboring communities. We have our own municipal railroad to support our port activities, where we're bringing in container ships in and out of the port to connect to BNSF and UP. Then, of course, we have our own water departments, and we have, of course, storm and sanitary divisions as well. So from my perspective, from public works standpoint, not only was I dealing with franchises, but I also had to deal with our own internal departments and anybody that working in the right-of-way, such as our contracting community, our private developers, our small mom-and-pop contractors as well. So I had to make sure that I was focused globally, not just on the franchises. And speaking internally, some of the, to my shock and dismay, I think, is most of the feedback and pushback that we got was actually from our own internal departments. I think that I worked very hard one-on-one with a lot of department directors and a lot of division managers, my cohorts, during this process to make sure that they understood what we were trying to accomplish, and also just to make sure that they understood that council, most of the council, was in support of what we were trying to do. What we had was part of a problem was we had a very outdated right-of-way code. The section that I was enforcing actually was written in the 1970s. It had a lot of holes in it and a lot of unclear specification or code requirements. Like Ken alluded to, one section of the code said that permits were required for all public utilities, including our cable company. Another section of the code said that they weren't required to take out permits. And that caused a lot of consternation for the franchise utilities, because look, if you're making me do it, making me pay for a permit, then you should be making them pay for it as well. So as we started working through the code and trying to make sure that everybody was playing on the same field of play, that caused a lot of consternation for Comcast, or for Click, and for our other utilities. Also, we had the city of Tacoma streets, unfortunately, are in very bad condition, particularly our residential streets. So our city council wanted us, the Public Works Department, to start creating new policies on restoration within our right-of-way. And if you come in and you dig into our street, that you had to do more restoration, larger patches, etc. So just prior to us taking on this initiative, we had created the right-of-way restoration policy, which required larger patches. It also required that if you had numerous patches within 75 feet, or three or more patches within 75 feet, you had to make that one giant patch. It also had a 5-year moratorium placed on newly constructed streets, so that if you came into our right-of-way, had to excavate into our street, you could only do so with the permission from our city engineer, and then the restoration requirements will be pretty extensive, basically full width of the street from property line to property line. So that was causing some consternation for both the franchise utilities and also our public utilities. We also had started working on our ADA transition plan to make sure that we met with the federal requirements for making our city accessible. And we developed a curb ramp matrix policy as well at the same time, which required all utilities to install curb ramps when they're doing their capital improvement projects. So when we started down this path of rewriting the code, they just saw it as another grab from Public Works to make sure that we're using their resources to reconstruct our infrastructure. And then the schedule was really difficult for us. Keeping 20 people actively involved in a process is very difficult when you got, they have their own programs that they have to manage, et cetera, and just trying to keep them on task and keeping them engaged was a challenge. So some of the things in the code that we tried to implement that caused our own utilities consternation was we required that all permits, all people working within the right-of-way, including our public utilities, have take out a permit for any activity in the right-of-way. We had a lot of conversation about how do you deal with routine maintenance. Somebody has to come in and adjust a gate valve, or erect a transformer or something that they consider routine maintenance. So what we did is we created an annual permit, and it required that all utilities take out a permit annually that allowed for routine maintenance. And we defined routine maintenance as work that could be accomplished within 24 hours. And it's worked out pretty good. They're required to pay for inspections time on a time and materials basis, and then they're required to give the Public Works Department 24-hour notice in advance of performing the work. We also required that they provide traffic control plans within the city. Although the franchise utilities were required to submit traffic control plans to our traffic engineering group, our public utilities did not. All they had to do was just go out there and start setting up traffic controls. So in order to minimize the number of impacts that we had to our traveling public, we also then required that traffic control plans be submitted for review to our traffic engineering section. And then we also included that they provide a pedestrian access route plan through their projects. We also encourage joint planning of projects. You know, we encouraged that if you're going in and trenching, that you contact either the franchise utility if it's a city project, or vice versa, to have conduit installed as part of your project. And then there's a sharing of costs identified in the code as well. And then we created a GIS mapping layer in our GIS mapping system for capital improvement projects, that any project that is being constructed in the city of Tacoma, any capital project constructed in Tacoma, now has to be mapped on our GIS mapping system. You're required to identify the limits of the project, the anticipated schedule, and a general scope of work. And so far that's played out pretty good. All the utilities, both private and public, have been very good about making sure that that's updated and kept up to date. And then just the bureaucracy. Anybody who's worked in the government understands that we move at the pace of a snail. And I think actually even probably slower than snails at times. But you know, like Ken alluded to, we have a lot of committee meetings and a lot of public forum meetings and meeting with various stakeholders. But what really surprised me was just kind of the politics that went into play. When we went into our first committee meeting, I was shocked at the conversations that one council member had who opposed what we were doing, and our mayor that was all for what we were doing, and just kind of that dynamic that was happening behind the scenes. I wasn't prepared for that, just being a staff member. So far, the code's been in place for 4 years. It actually was adopted on September 22nd of 2009. It's definitely improved the city's ability to enforce work in the right-of-way. It clearly sets expectations for permitting and bonding requirements. Some of the issues that we have is the bonding requirements that we have are for everybody, but particularly our smaller contractors are struggling with trying to meet the bonding requirements. So we've come up with some creative ways through our legal department to make sure that they're meeting the intent of the code. Our annual permit, even though it's working probably 95% of the time, we're still having some problems with people forgetting to call inspectors. So we've got work out there that's never been inspected. And then we also had a section on public outreach that required anybody working within the right-of-way to notify the citizens in the vicinity 5 days in advance of digging up the street. And sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But for the most part, I think the code that we rewrote for the public works side was phenomenal. Ken did an excellent job making sure that we had a very good process outlined. I think that's your slide.
So one last slide, just with a couple of suggestions when you're working with an outside consultant, and this actually is not just for rights-of-way, and for a lot of you already know this, but come up with a budget in advance, make it a part of your written contract so everybody understands what you're going to be paying. If you're the consultant, keep track of it. It is much easier to go back to the client 3 months before you go over budget and say, due to these changes and circumstances, it looks like we're going to have to spend a little bit more, and give them a heads up, as opposed to when you get your bill draft and you're looking at it and you realize, oh my gosh, we're over budget. And if you're on the staff side, keep an eye on it, monitor it, and be prepared. If it looks like there are changed circumstances and you're going to go over, then you're either going to have to cut back the scope of your project, or you're going to have to get more money allocated to the project. The one thing that Ray and I collectively forgot to put in this PowerPoint presentation was a link to the code. So I know that NATOA is going to post these, and we will add to this a link to Chapter 10.24 of the Tacoma Municipal Code, which is the right-of-way section that we've been talking about. And feel free to review it and use it to the extent that you think it might be helpful to you and your community. So we'll, I know we'll take questions at the end, and we'll turn it over to Mary. I just wanted to see that. We should probably play with that.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Mary LaFave with CenturyLink, and I have lived in a variety of cities, including Seattle, Seattle, Denver, and now just recently moved back to Minneapolis. So I've had a great experience with the company, and I'm very pleased to be on this panel. I have not only responsibility for cable franchising and strategy for the company as a whole, but also I have teams of people that work directly with the local government representatives in both Colorado and Minnesota. So I get to experience this from end to end, and it's quite wonderful. But before I get into our experiences with the rights of way and the management of them and our access to them, I really want to take a little time to talk about CenturyLink. Since just being in the panel discussions earlier today, I've heard all sorts of mention about AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, Charter, Time Warner Cable, and not a word about CenturyLink. And how do I make this move? Wrong direction. Okay, so I do want to just take a quick opportunity to give you just a little bit of information about the company. CenturyLink, as you may know, started out as a very small phone company headquartered in Monroe, Louisiana, which is still its headquarters, even though we are now the third largest telecommunications provider in the country. And in case you don't know about Monroe, just to give you a little bit more insight into it, it is also the home of Duck Dynasty, which many of you from your cable TV may be familiar with, and they are good friends with our president and CEO, Glenn Post, who is an avid duck hunter. But as I said, we are the third largest telecommunications company. We serve major metropolitan areas. We serve incredibly rural areas, whether it's Montana, Wyoming, remote places out on the East Coast. We have in Wyoming, for example, local loops that are miles and miles long. We are not purely a densely populated area in which we serve. And we really are focusing on providing advanced services, broadband-rich, fiber-based services to both local households, residential customers, as well as governments and large enterprise companies. So here's just a map. This just briefly shows you the green areas, which are service territories as a whole, principally as a phone company, broadband provider, and in some instances as a cable provider, as well as it shows you our robust fiber network that is the basis for all of our services that are data rich. We have major data centers. We acquired recently, within the past 5 years, a company called Savvis, which is truly a world recognized on an international basis for cloud computing data hosting centers. What you will notice, and this to me is the most important as it relates to this discussion, these are our 4 really strategic products that we focus on: broadband enhancement and expansion, Prism TV, which is not as broadly deployed. We are in approximately 15 markets right now and looking to expand. Fiber to the tower that enables the 4G and higher speeds for wireless broadband, and then our managed hosting and data services. What to me is the most critical about this slide and the future of our company and its growth opportunities is every one of these strategic initiatives requires and necessitates our access to the public rights of way in each and every one of your cities and counties. And so we simply hope to continue working to make that process better and more timely in terms of doing it. So the things, that I wanted to cover with number 1 truly, if there's one message that I've heard over and over, whether it's at this conference, whether it is on a national or local, discussion basis, it is broadband, access to broadband at high speeds is absolutely essential. And the bottom line is, if you want higher and better broadband speeds, you have got to recognize that that requires fiber in your rights-of-way and equipment in the rights-of-way. You cannot have it both ways. If you want higher speeds, you need to accept that we need reasonable and timely access to the public rights-of-way. Secondly, I am going to give you illustrations of there are real consequences when we don't get it. And the consequence that you ought to care the most about, and I have some stories and statistics about it, is that we truly are not able to deploy the higher broadband speeds, et cetera, if we can't get reasonable and timely access to the rights-of-way. And really our message, and we have some real success stories to this, I believe, and we would like to continue to have those grow. I think that this is a form of a partnership where there needs to be good communication about what we need, and we need to understand your concerns, and we need to work together to see if there isn't a way to come up with a way to get good access to the rights-of-way while making sure that we account for and address your interests. So, first of all, can't have it both ways. I was thinking back when, at one point way back in the history of my company, formerly known as US West, we had wireless operations, and this is when I lived up in Seattle, and one of the most pressing problems at that time, so this was back in the late 90s, was people going, we have got to have improved wireless coverage. I go into dead zones, and I know that that issue is still happening today. But the message back was, and particularly to the consumers, if you don't want dead zones, you're going to have to cope with these ugly towers in your neighborhood. And we can work together like we have in, I know if you go down I-25 between Denver and Colorado Springs, and actually it's fairly subtle, but they have wireless towers that are masquerading as lodgepole pines. And so is it perfect? No, but is it a lot better? Absolutely. And that to me is the kind of collaboration that says we understand everyone's issues, but you want the wireless coverage, you have got to have the towers. Similarly, you want, as I said, you want the broadband speeds, it is fiber in your right-of-way and the remote terminals. So Seattle, I want to have a special thank you to Tony Perez, because I believe that we are in the process of trying to work well together to come up and really improve the current situation we have in Seattle, which is, intolerable is too strong a word, but it is just very unattractive from our perspective in terms of having certainty about timeliness and cost of access and, if any, access to the public rights-of-way. There are actually rules in place right now that enable, when we go out to a neighborhood and we have to put a remote terminal out there, if one person in a certain radius of the remote terminal objects to its placement, it doesn't go. And if it doesn't go, suddenly they are looking at being able to have speeds with the remote terminal, fiber-fed remote terminal of up to 40 megabits and higher, to about a copper wire served out of our central office that likely at best is going to give them about 5 meg depending on how long their loop is. But Tony Perez, in working with CenturyLink, we believe truly recognizes that we need to improve this process. We're in the process of working with potentially a trial in one particular Seattle neighborhood to really work through and manage what can we do as a company to improve this, whether it's make it look nicer, any other considerations, and at the same time make certain that the city inadvertently is not creating absolute bars to it. So let me talk a little bit about that in terms of the consequences. And Seattle is the best example. We have made enormous investments over time in broadband. And I know from everyone's perspective, enormous is not enough if you don't have all the speeds that you're looking for, but we're doing our darndest. But in Seattle, for example, our access, our ability to provide 40 megabit and higher speeds is currently at about 13% of all the living units. This is in sharp contrast to other ones of our major metropolitan areas where that access is at 40% and higher. And all roads lead back to we can't get reasonable and timely access to the public rights-of-way. And in fact, we have, for us, we go through an annual budget process, where our capital budget is about $3 billion. And that gets obviously spread over the whole company in a variety of products and services. But we always go through and go, where do we need to improve our broadband footprint? What do those jobs look like, et cetera? We have had to cancel from about 2009 to date in Seattle alone numerous projects that would have brought the higher broadband speeds of up to 40 megabit to over 65,000 living units. And so that's just a classic example of where it doesn't work. Not to focus on Seattle, so I'll move to a different city, Salt Lake City, which there was absolutely zero certainty about how long it would take to get a permit and then at what cost, and maybe not ever get it at all, depending on what happened with the permitting process. As a result of that, when in about the 2005 time frame, that we started really rolling out fiber to the node, so driving fiber into the neighborhoods to a remote terminal, and then putting the electronics, the DSLAMs, out there that would enable the higher broadband speeds. It was so onerous and so uncertain that we just stopped the deployment of fiber to the node altogether with Salt Lake City and just said, we've got to do something. We actually came up with a solution. While it has improved access, it, in my mind, isn't the perfect solution, because here's what we worked out with the city. The city said, oh my gosh, it's tough dealing with the consumers who hate these structures in their on their property, et cetera. So as a consequence, the model that we follow in Salt Lake City is that we work first to get a private easement. But the cost of a private easement is between $5,000 and $10,000 per site versus approximately $1,000 to $1,500 if we go through the normal permitting process. So that drives our cost up, and that just eats away at additional broadband deployment. But the good news is to the extent we are not successful after reasonable efforts to get a private easement, then when we go back to the city and file some kind of conditional use or some kind of special permitting process, the city thus far has been 100% supportive of our efforts and need to deploy remote terminals and fiber in the public rights-of-way to continue the expansion of the broadband footprint. So there, while it's a more costly solution, it is one that is working and has certainly changed the dynamics in Salt Lake City from having zero deployment back in 2005, 2006, to having a good, strong, robust fiber to the node footprint with speeds up to 40 megabit there. But we have other cities. Colorado Springs, we made an effort, again, back in about 2005, to just go head-to-head and really compete. This was when Comcast was really starting to up their speeds. And I'll tell you, Colorado Springs, and I don't know what makes it so magical, but whether it's effective, good use of your relationships between the city, et cetera, and the company, but we had back then, and we continue to have very timely and robust deployment of fiber. It speeds up to 40 megabit in the city of Colorado Springs. And that was one of the reasons that as we looked at deploying PRISM outside of the traditional footprint, where before CenturyLink acquired Quest, CenturyLink had deployed its PRISM service only in those areas that had statewide franchises for the video product, because their observation was it was just too difficult and onerous to work on getting local franchises. So we've stepped up to that model, and in that regard, it was a little challenging from time to time in Colorado Springs, but nonetheless, the fact of our success in our fiber footprint made that a very attractive market. And in fact, now we've had a hugely successful deployment in truly bringing robust competition to the city of Colorado Springs. We've had similar efforts just to sell our PRISM product in Omaha, Phoenix, in the local areas, and then obviously our other markets.
Mary, I think we're running a little bit
sorry.
long, so
at any rate, I have just a couple of asks. reasonable work and work with us. We truly are happy to do so. And we have efforts underway. We understand they're ugly, so if we can build, work with you to, kind of mask them in some ways. We've had efforts about wrapping them so that they blend in with the scenery, so that they are anti-graffiti, and those kind of efforts. The last thing, and I wish I'd saved myself more time for this, is truly the one thing that we absolutely need and respectfully request is no sweetheart deals. Everyone should have the same terms of access to the public rights of way. And we will work with you on, deploying what you need and getting some kind of quid pro quo, but truly, every single provider that has access to the rights of way should be having access on exactly the same terms and conditions. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I think we might have time to squeeze in one question or so if anybody has anything. Otherwise, feel free to approach any of the presenters during the conference.
I have a comment and a question for the whole panel. Broadband internet services are not subject to franchise fees. Yet there's no question that the fiber or coax cables that are necessary to provide those services are installed on city right-of-way. This creates a disconnect between the industry's expectations for access to the right-of-way and the city's concerns over dwindling franchise revenues, especially when there is no right-of-way management ordinance. How do we engage in a fruitful discussion with the industry so that there is equal access to rights-of-way, both from the perspective of the industry wanting access, but also from the cities getting revenues for that use?
Well, somehow they're pointing to me, so I'll go ahead. I would say my answer is go to Congress and talk to congressmen, especially, unfortunately, in this case, my Senator Wyden, who's the sponsor of the Internet Tax Freedom Act, and get them to recognize that the time when the internet needed a subsidization is long past, and you have a situation where it's, as you say, it's using the right-of-way and it's not paying for it, and that creates a problem for local governments.
Right. And I would add to that, I think there's a two-pronged approach, and neither one of them are fun or easy. I agree with the idea of lobbying in Washington and through our national associations, both in the TOA and League of Cities and the Conference of Mayors and National Association of Counties. But given the toxic political environment in Washington and the ability of the Congress to do anything, I think we all know what the odds of this kind of an issue getting serious consideration from the Congress are, which means we have to deal with it at the state level as well. And unfortunately, there are some states that have preempted franchising ability, sometimes across the board, sometimes just for internet and telephone, but not for cable, like in my state. And I think the only way to change that is to engage in the discussions with the industry players and come to some kind of compromise agreement that recognizes back to the point I was making in my presentation, I think the legitimate rights of local governments are for the use of public property. Now, can we get there? I don't know. It's not going to be easy. There's, as Mary pointed out, every time, the access to the rights of way is a cost of doing business. We want bigger, faster broadband, and if we talk about franchise fees, we're talking about increasing their costs. I think there's a great case to be made why that shouldn't slow down deployment, but I understand the arguments that you'll get from the other side. I'd be interested to hear what her answer to this question is. But I agree with you, Gabriel. I think that regardless of the kind of infrastructure, whether it's fiber or coaxial cable or copper, it is taking up space and it is causing impacts to public property and is enabling private sector entities to generate profits by the use of public property, and we should have a technology neutral rule for how local governments are compensated for the use of that property. Right,
Well,
Mary?
Remember the word reasonable. So, truly, I honestly am not aware of any instance, speaking on behalf of CenturyLink, where we have access to the public rights-of-way and do not pay for that privilege. So I wish that I were,
Colorado. For telephone and internet.
For telephone and internet, but we pay other taxes, et cetera. And I apologize, I was thinking for just pulling the permits itself. But what I think is most important is that there is a balance, and we've got to figure out what is the reasonable source of income associated with a product and come up with some way, again, it's a tax, to tax it reasonably and evenly, and not to make certain that there is imbalance in how that is done.
Tony, do you have a question?
Yes, thanks. Tony Perez, Seattle. Mary, thank you for your comments. I think we are moving the ball downfield, and I encourage CenturyLink to consider bringing the PRISM product to Seattle. My question, though, is to Ken and Milo. You had talked about the importance of amending the cable code prior to beginning negotiations with the cable operator. And I was wondering if did you find that when you were undergoing that process, that even though you were dealing with police power issues and provisions that you could unilaterally adopt, did it become an occasion for beginning part of the franchise negotiations? In other words, did the providers come to you and say, well, even though you can do that, we'd rather you didn't, and maybe we can talk about other considerations that might be more important to you?
Yeah, Tony, that's a great question. I would say actually just the opposite. Is Brian still here? Since we kind of worked together on this. Okay. What I remember more so with Comcast than with Click was they said, before we get too far into negotiations, we want to see what you guys are going to do with the right-of-way code and the cable code. Jeff is nodding, so I'm obviously remembering that correctly. So I think there was an understanding of what the city was trying to accomplish and a recognition that it was a valid goal for the city to accomplish, and they didn't want to get too far into franchise negotiations to see whether they were going to have any problems with the code issues.
Thanks.
Anything you want to add to that?
All right, I think one last question. Oh, okay, one last question. And, oh, no last questions? 12:15. Okay, we have 10 minutes.
All right. Jerry, you want to sing a song?
Yeah, I'll sing. I was going to sing Hall & Oates, I Can't Go For That, as opposed to the Beatle one, which I never heard of. Mary, first of all, thank you for coming. Right? I mean, you know, I know this is your job to work with us, but it's one of these things is not like the others. We get that, right? Let me ask a really tough question and an unfair question, and I understand that as I ask it. You use this wonderful term, remote terminal. Others of us would use vault or refrigerator or describe it a bit more graphically. Is it worth putting up with that in the front yard for only 40 megs? If all the research that we hear tells us that that speed's not nearly enough, and so why do we go through all the hassle and trouble of dealing with those for a speed that probably is behind the times by the time it's deployed?
So thank you for that question. And no, and I understand exactly what you're saying, but technology does continue to move forward, and one of the things that we're trialing as we speak is pair bonding, so that we can take a 40 meg pipe with pair bonding that becomes 80 meg. There are constantly changes coming on the horizon that will continue to enable those speeds, recognizing that the need for speed keeps on going at probably a higher level. But also, we are exploring, our model internally right now is in greenfield areas, so that our engineering specs say that in greenfield areas, we actually deploy fiber to the home and do not do fiber to the node. But it's a real issue about what is the cost to deploy, how do you manage that, particularly with the legacy network that we are working with. So we continue to look at ways to improve it, and hopefully, as electronics improve, maybe the size of those, vaults whatever you want to call them, will start coming down in size. But we understand exactly what you're saying, and we appreciate the need for increasing speed. We're working on it.
Hi, Jeff Leader, City of Tacoma. And Mary, just a follow-up question. You mentioned the 15 cities where Prism TV is being implemented. Do you have franchises in those 15 cities for that service? And then how do you treat PEG channels for that?
So right now, Prism has been launched in pursuant to statewide franchises in 3 cities in Florida, 1 or 2 cities in North Carolina, 2 in Missouri, several in Wisconsin, La Crosse Market, Las Vegas, Nevada, and then a very small footprint pursuant to a local franchise in Alabama, Phoenix Metro, Colorado Springs, Omaha. We have those entire markets where we've launched it. We do offer PEG. Our PEG is not, we had originally talked in terms, waiting to see what happened with the FCC, about implementing the AT&T model that is so unpopular with so many people. But we have a new one that we have launched in Phoenix, where the whole Phoenix Valley uses all government channels, use Channel 11, and they advertise it, market it down there. And so what we've done there is to create what we call the mosaic, so that each PEG channel each PEG broadcast has its own unique channel assignment, so you can record it, etc. But when you turn on Channel 11, it has all of the picture-in-a-picture of each one, whether it's Tempe, Scottsdale, Phoenix, etc., of the government access channels, and then you just click on it, and that will take you directly to that channel, and instantly voila. But you can also, throughout the valley, watch any other PEG channel to your heart's content. So that's how we are currently working on it. So we do have a discrete channel for each PEG.
To kind of address Gabriel's point, we all developed or lived with a model now for a long time about the way that we collect fees is on revenues. And it was a very easy model for us to implement, and it worked well because it phased in with the folks actually building out their systems. Is it time we considered a different model? I mean, if we've got people that are occupying rights of way, shouldn't they be paying for their actual occupancy and not for especially the revenues that they generate from that occupancy, which would also solve the problem of they can do whatever they want with it as long as they pay for being in the rights of way.
Yes.
That was easy, kid, so how do you make it happen?
Well, how do you make it happen gets back to that issue of having to work it with your industry partners and with your state legislatures and perhaps with Congress. And it ain't going to be easy, and we all know that. Uh-oh.
Steve Traylor, Executive Director of NATOA. I really don't have a question for you all. I really have more of a comment than anything else. And Ken, I want to thank you for putting this panel together. I think a few years ago, we would have been in this room and we would have seen slide after slide of bad movements by industry of putting equipment in the rights of way. And I think what you did is actually reflecting what we're trying to do in DC, and that's to show the federal regulators that local governments really want to work with industry to get this equipment out and at the same time protect local governments' rights-of-way authority and make sure that those rights-of-way are protected, that the compensation is paid, but at the same time making sure that deployment is speeded up. Your comments about how you approached a code review in Tacoma was really inspiring, I think, and folks really need to listen to that. The one thing I've heard from providers in DC is we're not so concerned about how long it takes to get our equipment out. We just want certainty in the process. So if we know steps A through Z of what we have to do, that is a big concern to us. That's that sense of certainty of getting this stuff done. And by going through and revising your codes to make sure that there is a good blueprint so that the city, counties, and industry know where you're going plays a big part. So I'm glad this is being streamed out there. I think your message was really important to folks, and thank you all.
I was going to say, you look a lot like NATO's executive director in a shirt and tie.
there are no more questions, everybody should enjoy lunch. Thank you.
Good job. Yeah.